If modern economics has a birth certificate, it is dated 1796, not because markets were invented that year, but because for the first time, someone explained them honestly. Adam Smith did not discover self-interest trade or profit. Humanity had lived with all three for millennia. What Smith did was far more dangerous and far more enduring. He stripped away moral panic, royal mythology, and mercantilist superstition, and revealed the economic system as it actually functioned beneath the surface of power. The Wealth of Nations was not a celebration of greed. It was an autopsy of illusion. To appreciate Smith's revolution, one must understand the world he confronted. 18th century Europe believed wealth was finite. Nations grew rich only by impoverishing rivals. Gold and silver were power. Trade was war by other means. Governments regulated obsessively monopolies, granted guilds, protected imports, restricted exports, subsidized. Economic life was a chessboard controlled by kings and ministers who believed prosperity could be commanded by decree. This doctrine mercantilism dominated policy not because it worked, but because it flattered authority. Smith entered this world not as a revolutionary firebrand, but as a moral philosopher. He was deeply concerned with sympathy, justice, and human behavior. His earlier work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, explored how societies function through shared norms rather than coercion. When he turned his attention to economics, he carried this lens with him. He asked a simple but subversive question: what if order in markets emerges not from control, but from coordination? The answer would change history. Smith observed that individuals pursuing their own interest, earning a living, improving their condition, often produced outcomes no planner could design. The famous invisible hand was not mystical, it was descriptive. When people specialize exchange and compete within stable rules, resources flow toward their most valued uses. Prices become signals. Profits become incentives. Losses become discipline. Wealth expands, not because anyone intends it, but because systems reward efficiency over time. This was heresy. Smith's most radical insight was not that markets work, but that wealth comes from productivity, not hoarding. A nation's prosperity, he argued, lay not in its treasury, but in its capacity to produce goods and services efficiently. Division of labor, illustrated famously by the pin factory, multiplied output beyond imagination. Specialization sharpened skill, saved time, and encouraged innovation. Growth, Smith showed, was endogenous. It emerged from structure, not conquest. Equally revolutionary was Smith's critique of monopoly and state favoritism. He was no anarchist. He believed in justice, defense, infrastructure, and education. But he despised the collusion between merchants and the state. People of the same trade, he warned, seldom meet together. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. This was not an endorsement of business power. It was a warning. Smith understood that markets only function when competition restrains self-interest. Without it, capitalism decays into rent-seeking. This nuance is often lost. Smith did not argue for the absence of government. He argued against government captured by private interest. He opposed tariffs not because he loved foreigners, but because he understood that protection enriches producers at the expense of consumers. He opposed regulation not because rules were bad, but because bad rules froze inefficiency in place. His vision was not laissez-faire chaos, but institutional clarity. Simple rules enforced impartially, allowing human energy to organize itself. Timing mattered. The Wealth of Nations appeared as Britain stood at the edge of industrial transformation. Capital was accumulating. Trade networks expanded. Financial institutions matured. Smith did not cause capitalism, but he gave it a language, a logic, and a moral defense. For the first time, economic growth was framed not as a zero-sum contest, but as a positive-sum process. The political implications were immense. If wealth could grow organically, then conquest was unnecessary. If markets coordinated activity better than ministers, then centralized control was suspect. Smith's ideas traveled quietly at first through pamphlets, debates, and policy circles, but their influence was relentless. Over decades, tariffs fell, guilds weakened, markets widened, industrial capitalism accelerated. Yet Smith's legacy is often misunderstood because it is selectively remembered. He is invoked to justify deregulation, yet ignored when he condemns monopoly. He is praised for efficiency, yet neglected when he warns of worker alienation. Smith recognized that division of labor, while productive, could dull the human mind if left unchecked. He feared that societies obsessed with output might neglect virtue education and civic life. This tension between efficiency and humanity runs through his work like a fault line. Smith also understood finance better than many of his modern admirers. He warned against excessive debt, speculative bubbles, and the seductive power of credit. He had witnessed the South Sea bubble and recognized how financial innovation could outpace understanding. Markets, he believed, required restraint, not from morality alone, but from institutional design. Left entirely to euphoria, they would destroy themselves. In this sense, Smith stands not as capitalism's cheerleader, but as its first serious psychologist. What makes the wealth of nations endure is not its prescriptions, many of which belong to its time, but its framework. Smith taught the world to ask how incentives shape behavior, how institutions channel self-interest, and how unintended consequences dominate economic outcomes. Every modern economic debate about trade inequality, regulation, globalization traces its lineage back to these questions. Standing at the threshold of modernity, Adam Smith did not promise utopia. He promised something more unsettling: that prosperity would emerge, not from virtue alone, but from properly constrained self-interest. Not from genius planners, but from ordinary people responding to prices and opportunities. This vision removed economics from the realm of kings and placed it into the fabric of daily life. And yet embedded within Smith's optimism was a warning that history would repeat relentlessly. Markets are powerful servants, but dangerous masters. When their moral foundations erode, when competition gives way to concentration, when productivity is divorced from broad prosperity, the system he described begins to fracture. Smith saw this possibility clearly, even as he celebrated the engine he had revealed. As Britain and the world began to apply his ideas, they would discover both their brilliance and their limits. Industrial growth would lift millions and immiserate others. Wealth would expand and concentrate. Markets would innovate and destabilize. Smith had opened the door to modern economics, but what lay beyond that door would be far more complex than even he could fully anticipate. A complexity that would force future generations to reinterpret his ideas, argue over his intentions, and grapple with the consequences of a system that could create abundance without guaranteeing justice. A system whose foundations he had laid, but whose evolution would unfold in ways that neither he nor his contemporaries could fully control. An evolution that would eventually raise the question not of whether markets work, but of how they must be shaped to serve societies rather than dominate them. A question that would only become sharper as industrial capitalism matured, and the invisible hand revealed both its creative and destructive power. A question that history would continue to revisit as the world moved deeper into the age of markets, an age whose contradictions would unfold across centuries as Smith's ideas escaped the pages of a book and entered factories, parliaments, and lives, revealing that understanding how wealth is created is only the beginning of deciding how it should be governed. For once, the wealth of nations left the study and entered the world. It ceased to belong to Adam Smith alone. In the decades after 1776, Smith's framework became the intellectual scaffolding of industrial capitalism. Britain's factories multiplied, powered by specialization, exactly as Smith had described. Productivity soared. Prices fell. Goods once reserved for elites became accessible to ordinary households. The invisible hand appeared to be working with astonishing force. Nations that embraced freer trade and competitive markets surged ahead of those clinging to mercantilist controls. Smith's diagnosis seemed confirmed by history itself, but the same process exposed the tensions Smith had warned about. Division of labor increased output, yet narrowed lives. Workers became extensions of machines, repeating tasks until skill turned into monotony. Urbanization uprooted communities. Wealth expanded, but unevenly. Capital accumulated faster than wages. Smith had foreseen this risk. He argued that without education and moral development, a highly specialized workforce could become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. This was not rhetoric. It was foresight. The 19th century became an argument with Adam Smith rather than a rejection of him. Thinkers like Ricardo extended his logic to trade and rents. Marx inverted it, arguing that the same market forces Smith celebrated would inevitably concentrate power and alienate labor. Governments experimented, sometimes embracing laissez-faire, sometimes intervening aggressively. Crises arrived. Panics exposed the fragility of unregulated finance. Inequality provoked unrest. Each episode forced a reinterpretation of Smith's core insight. Markets are powerful but not self-sufficient. What endured was Smith's method rather than his policy prescriptions. He taught economists to look beyond intention to outcome beyond morality, to incentives beyond authority to structure. This approach shaped modern economics profoundly. Supply and demand curves price, signals opportunity cost all trace. Intellectual lineage to Smith's insistence that economic behavior follows patterns grounded in human nature, not royal command. Yet perhaps Smith's most misunderstood contribution is his humility. He never claimed markets were perfect. He never argued they were moral by default. He argued they were informative, revealing what societies valued through prices and choices. When those signals became distorted by monopoly privilege or political capture, markets ceased to serve the public. Smith's solution was not blind faith, but vigilance competition, as discipline institutions as guardrails. This is why Smith remains relevant in an age far removed from pin factories. Modern economies wrestle with the same questions he posed. How much should the state intervene? When does market power become abuse? How do we balance efficiency with equity, globalization with resilience? Smith offers no easy answers, but he offers a framework grounded in realism. He reminds us that self-interest is neither angel nor demon. It is a force to be channeled. When crises strike, Smith's warnings resurface. Financial bubbles reveal what happens when incentives reward speculation over productivity. Monopolistic platforms echo his fears of concentrated power. Debates over free trade and protection replay arguments he articulated centuries ago. Even the modern tension between markets and democracy reflects his concern that economic power, left unchecked, bends political institutions toward private ends. And yet Smith's optimism also deserves attention. He believed that ordinary people, when allowed to exchange freely within fair rules, could generate prosperity no ruler could design. This belief underpins modern living standards more than any single policy. It is why economic growth became possible without conquest, why innovation flourished, why societies could imagine progress as cumulative rather than cyclical. Looking back, Adam Smith did not found a doctrine. He founded a conversation, one that has never ended. His work stands at the origin of economics, not because it settled debates, but because it framed them honestly. He acknowledged trade-offs rather than denying them. He trusted systems more than individuals, yet warned that systems rot without moral foundations. He believed wealth could grow, but never forgot that societies must decide what that wealth is for. The final lesson of The Wealth of Nations is therefore not ideological, but historical. Markets are tools, not destinies. They can liberate energy or concentrate power. They can spread abundance or deepen division. Their outcomes depend less on slogans than on institutions, on laws, norms, and memory. Smith gave us the lens to see this clearly. What we do with that vision remains our responsibility. If this journey into Adam Smith's world reshaped how you think about market self-interest or the role of the state, share what resonated most with you. And if you want to continue exploring how ideas forged centuries ago still shape today's economic battles, follow the channel and stay with this story. Because the foundations of modern economics are not relics of the past, but living forces that continue to shape every decision we make about wealth, power, and the future.